이번 발표는 마이크로 그리드 분야입니다. 그래서 영국 블룸버그 유 에너지 파이낸스의 로겐 골디 스콧 시니어 애널리스트님께서 마이크로 그리드 시장 현황에 대해서 발표를 진행해 주시겠습니다. 네, 로겐 골디 스콧 시니어 애널리스트님은 블룸버그 TV 연사를 비롯해서 유틸리티 기술 기업, 정책 자문 등의 활동을 하고 계시고 현재 에너지 저장 시장의 글로벌 분석을 담당하고 계십니다. 로겐 골디 스콧 시니어 애널리스트님을 박수로 맞이해 주시기 바랍니다.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the chair and to the conference organisers for putting together such a great event. I'll try and keep this sort of relatively snappy. I'm sort of grateful that so many of you sort of turned up after the coffee break. It's and lots of smiling faces, so I can see many of you were tempted. But what I'd like to do is just give a bit of a brief overview on the sort of global microgrid market. And before I do that, I'll just sort of give a bit of background, I suppose. So, as the chair mentioned, my name is Logan Goldie Scot, and actually my main focus within Bloomberg New Energy Finance is on the stationary energy storage market and the industry. But then within that, we do actually sort of, as we'll see later, so we do incorporate some microgrids and other distributed generation as part of that sort of broader package. For those of you who aren't familiar with Bloomberg New Energy Finance, I mean, New Energy Finance was actually a standalone company founded in 2004. And then now it's been sort of fully integrated after an acquisition by Bloomberg. So the acquisition happened in 2009, and then Bloomberg's been around since sort of the early 80s. New Energy Finance just has a division. We're sort of 200 people strong, spread across sort of 15 offices globally. So I actually sort of flew in yesterday from our London office, and then I spent sort of most of yesterday just in our office here in Seoul, which is sort of which has been fantastic. It's sort of first time to the city, so I'm very excited. In terms of what we actually do, we are a research and analysis company, really looking at the future of energy. So we started, I suppose, just looking at clean energy or renewable energy. There we were talking about some of the generation technologies, wind, solar, etc. And then as the market, as all of you will be familiar with, as the market really emerged and sort of grew, that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to look at these different sort of elements, these different smaller markets in a siloed fashion. You really had to understand what happens to the overall energy system when you are adding sort of different wind or solar technologies. How do you use transition technologies such as natural gas to sort of to help you sort of power through the future? And then looking at this here, I sit within the Energy Smart Technologies team. And so in the Energy Smart Technologies, we're looking at digital energies, so smart grid analytics, HEMS, etc. Then we also have energy efficiency, electrified transport, which we just heard from, and then energy storage, which is where I sit. But anyhow, to move sort of straight into this. Looking at microgrids, I thought it was important first to really try and define the topic because and actually before I dive into this, I apologize that many of the slides that you'll see here aren't actually in the booklet. If there are slides that you're particularly interested in, feel free to sort of come up to me after the presentation or to email at a later point. But so with microgrids, I wanted to define the topic because you have a very wide variety of sort of the types of microgrids. And starting with that, I suppose you have sort of island microgrids or sort of off-grid systems, so completely standalone systems. And I thought about whether we'd talk about them today, and we'll touch on them. But actually, in many cases, they're not the most interesting part of this market. In many aspects, it becomes sort of an engineering challenge, I suppose. You're looking at a specific site with specific sort of resource constraints or requirements, and then actually you're planning your resource mix due to the customer's need. Similarly with backup power. Backup power, here I'm thinking of sort of a single resource, let's say a diesel generator in a hospital. like once again, this is a huge market globally. But in terms of sort of trying to spark an interesting discussion, it's not as relevant. It just comes down to the single resource economics of that particular customer. So what I'd like to do is actually focus on this central segment, so general use microgrids. These can be sort of single or multiple resource. So you're using sort of different types of generation technologies, different types of sort of demand management technologies. And actually what we'll see is there are various different drivers and also sort of a wide range of different types of customer as well. So just to kick off with actually sort of what's driving this market, I mean, this is a relatively small market to date, with much of the activity that has actually been located in the US. But one of the drivers that is sort of globally applicable, I suppose, is this resiliency and reliability. So this is wherever a customer is willing to sort of pay a premium, or is just looking to do their utmost to secure a viable and affordable electricity supply, and also one that can react to sort of to natural challenges. And so this chart here tries to, I mean, what this really shows is the total cost of overall losses based on natural disasters going back from 1980 to last year, and you can also see the segmentation for insured losses as well. And so what you can see here is, even though some years go sort of up and down, actually the broader trend for both insured and overall losses is that the total cost is increasing. And virtually in any industry where we see sort of the total cost of something increasing, we're seeing innovation, and we're seeing sort of new companies come in and try and address that. This is actually, so having shown you the chart, this is just a photo that I quite like. I mean, partly because I don't own the car in this photo, so I can feel slightly happier about it. But for those of you who can't see, this is during Hurricane Sandy in downtown New York, and so much of New York was actually flooded, and so you can see the car sort of floating in the foreground, and then actually in the background you have a building, the backup generator, their version of sort of a single resource microgrid. In this case, it's working. And this actually, due to the customer in question, it caused a bit of a scandal in New York about sort of social inequality. But we can talk about that sort of after the presentation. So moving on. So we've talked about resilience, reliability. And then you have, of course, policy. I think most of the presentations we've heard today have touched upon policy in some sort of type or form. And in here, you can see this. This could be a sort of government-backed policy, could be a policy on a state level, and really anywhere, whether they're using it as grants or incentives, or whether it's mandating certain sort of resiliency or reliability measures, this is naturally and very predictably going to help drive a market. So just looking at that in the US example, there are currently 6 US states which have sort of policy support specifically targeting microgrids. There are a number of others that sort of indirectly do provide support to the industry. But here you can see a mixture between sort of community projects, they're largely community projects, because here actually there's a reliability issue, and so governments and states are eager to avoid some of the challenges. And if you look at the map here, similar to the previous photo, is many of the states that have implemented this are the relatively wealthy states that were hurt during Hurricane Sandy, for instance. And so that has been a big driver, particularly in the US market. Now, before I move on to the next driver, I'd just like to touch upon sort of the value of liberalized markets. And you can dive into a load of detail here, but in essence, what I'm looking at for a liberalized market is where you're able to generate and sell that electricity. Well, generate, consume, and then sell that electricity. As soon as you have those conditions, and so this is looking for any customer without a utility license, for instance, but as soon as you have those conditions, you can see some really interesting sort of case studies, really interesting sort of opportunities for organizations or individuals looking at microgrids. And one of those opportunities is actually high spark spreads. And so a spark spread is the difference between the cost of gas generation and then the retail electricity price in that market or in your region. And so there you're looking at, if you have relatively cheap gas generation, but a relatively high retail electricity price, then that is an opportunity for a microgrid. It's an opportunity for various technologies actually that involve essentially self-generation or self-consumption. And looking here, once again, just looking at the US market, you can see we actually do sort of analysis. We break it down. Where are the market opportunities depending on the spark spread? So without sort of dwelling too much, I suppose, on drivers and allowing us to actually dive into a bit of the nitty-gritty here, it's the last three are really sort of grouped together. So these are all drivers that essentially are a result or are resulting in sort of increasing end-user sophistication. So this is organizations or individuals actually paying much more attention to their energy management, how they pay their electricity bill, and often this is caused by what they're ultimately paying. If you feel you're paying too much for your electricity bill, typically you'll look for alternatives. And so I just wanted to highlight a few specific examples. So dynamic electricity prices. Here you can have these as sort of time of use pricing. You can have a consumption-based pricing, so your price changes depending on how much you use. Demand charges, it's a sort of a similar concept where you're paying an additional fee just for your peak demand. So even if you only hit that peak demand for 2 hours of the year, like 2 hours of the year, your peak demand is 100 times your average consumption. In many states, in many countries, you have to pay for that peak demand because you're paying for the grid to keep that option available to you. So in areas where you have high demand charges, that's naturally an opportunity for self-consumption and for microgrids. And standby charges are a similar concept where many utilities will charge a fee, or many sort of grid operators will actually charge a fee for when you want to do sort of regular maintenance to your system and when you have to reconnect to the grid. And once again, this is so that they are being sort of compensated for having that spare capacity and holding it throughout the year. So this list of drivers, I mean, in many cases, these are sort of all applicable, let's say, to the United States. And that's not a coincidence. I mean, we looked at these drivers and we looked at where the largest current market for sort of for general use microgrids was, and that's where you see the United States playing a role. So if you don't have these drivers in any given country, so any country that you're interested or any specific region, then you'll want to wonder sort of if there's an opportunity for microgrids. And this isn't sort of comprehensive, but it is the sum of some of the most important ones. So we looked there at the key drivers and sort of partly what the landscape actually looks like. If we now dive into the LCOE, so the levelized cost of electricity of different types of distributed generation, and here what you can see, I mean, we've just pulled up a list once again using a case study on sort of a piece of research that we published a few months ago, where we looked at a variety of different sort of fuel choices. So as you can see, in the average scenario, actually the small gas-fired reciprocating engine, combined heat and power, actually offered the lowest overall sort of levelized cost of electricity. With PV crystalline silicon, sort of slightly higher, then going all the way through sort of subsidized, non-subsidized fuel cells. This is in a US context there, and then increasing up to sort of the relatively high cost of actual backup diesel generation. And so the crucial thing when thinking of the levelized cost of electricity, and this applies really beyond the conversation about microgrids. This applies to the conversation about like your overall power system, like talking about sort of grid parity or socket parity for PV. When you're thinking in total system cost, the total sort of the cost of operating and running a system. the levelized cost of electricity is often actually not the most useful measure, because you do need to understand what the cost of sort of grid balancing and what the cost of actually sort of alternative capacity schemes are. And so what you do, and this will be familiar to any of you who sort of are working on microgrids, for instance, you end up having a blended levelized cost of electricity. And so what you can see here, so the dark purple line at the bottom, this represents the x-axis is the percent of electricity provided by each resource. And then the y-axis is the cost, so dollars per kilowatt hour. And so if you look at the dark purple line, this actually is being provided by gas combined heat and power. And so what we see, I think people get very excited about microgrids as a multi-resource technology where there's a huge sort of clean energy push. This is going to sort of to help us gain sort of green credits and generally sort of change our electricity system. In many cases, in the many examples where we're seeing this happen already, these are fossil fuel dominated microgrids. You may have multiple resources, but the bulk of the actual, the bulk of the sort of the blended LCOE and the percent of electricity provided by each of these resources is largely dominated by natural gas or another fossil fuel type. And so here you can see, gas CHP, then actually they have a megawatt of PV and then a sort of a 4 megawatt system for diesel, but you're holding that in reserve. And actually, out of interest, is anyone familiar with the 29 Palms project? It was a long shot. I mean, this is a project. So it's actually a California-based military. It's a Californian military base. And so what we see for many microgrids that are being deployed by the military is your percentage of diesel and the amount of diesel they'll keep in reserve is actually much higher than what you'd see in other circumstances, because there's a huge premium that they're willing to pay for utmost reliability. Having 99 points and 9% often isn't enough. They really need the 100% guarantee in their eyes, and so that's where you see you do see high proportions of diesel. But if we take a look at this, so this is actually sort of an add-on, so sort of phase 2 of the project, where what they did, they added another megawatt of PV, reduced the amount of sort of diesel that was actually being used, although the capacity stayed the same, and then added some sort of energy storage as well. And you can see that the blended levelized cost of energy falls to around sort of 10.5 cents a kilowatt hour, and this is. I think this is really interesting because this actually looks at it kind of touches upon the combinations that you can have with a microgrid or with any sort of electricity system. So what's the optimal balance of resource on that system? And so here, if you look at it, it's the lines that you really want to pay attention are the blended LCOE line. So your cost of generation, and then how is that comparing to the retail electricity price or the commercial electricity price? And as you see, sort of any of these for natural gas, for instance, I mean natural gas, the levelized cost of electricity, that's in the actual total cost of a sort of gas system is heavily driven by the fuel costs. And so in the US at the moment, you have remarkably cheap natural gas. We do see that rising over the coming years. Not necessarily to sort of to European or to the levels we see elsewhere and sort of across Asia, where it's sort of heavily importing LNG. But we do see that rising in the US, and so at that point, I mean, when does it become more attractive to reduce the amount of sort of natural gas in this scenario and add, let's say, a bit more PV or add some more storage? And here, this is just some work that I took from our solar team. So as I mentioned, I sit in the Energy Smart Technology team, but we really do cover sort of the whole breadth of low carbon technologies. And so this just shows the experience curve for PV modules on a logarithmic scale. And if this laser works, you can see these sort of light purple triangles are actually, they are sort of fixed data points that so these aren't sort of predictions, these aren't sort of calculations. These are actually we run a solar price index. And so on a monthly basis, we speak with both buyers and sellers of solar panels and across the value chain, and they submit. We sign non-disclosure agreements. They submit their actual contracts that they're signing prices at, and then we aggregate all of this and we publish the results. And so this is a great way for us to actually sort of really tap in and get a good feel for sort of where prices are. But the broader point with this chart is the cost of PV is falling. The cost of PV has been falling rapidly. I mean, now looking at this, what it looks like we're on sort of 60 cents a watt for a module. Like of course the total system cost will be sort of slightly higher than this, but we're talking sort of incredibly cheap systems. And I mean, it makes me think back to the days sort of 2007, 2008, where you had these sort of the scarcity of silicon, where you were seeing silicon or polysilicon going for $200 a kilogram, and comparing that to sort of the $22 a kilogram now, which is higher than it has been over the last couple of months. I mean, the PV costs have come down, and they're not reaching sort of the upper levels that we've seen in the past. Similarly, this is actually sort of a similar exercise that we run, just looking at sort of energy storage costs. I think my background is very much sort of most of my work at the company is focused on this stationary energy storage market, and so if we look at this, I mean, stationary lithium-ion energy storage costs are really, as we've heard in earlier presentations, they're really being driven by the sort of electric vehicle market, or the electrified transport market anyway. And so what we have here is actually our forecast of expected costs, and then the red crosses on this chart are actually similar to what I mentioned for the solar price index. This is actually our battery price index. So exactly the same principle, but then also sort of it's a less is certainly a less commoditized market. So we do speak to sort of industry sources as well. And what you can see, I mean, at the latest figure we saw for a lithium-ion battery pack, or the average price we had reported was just over $500 a kilowatt hour, which I believe was it was pretty close to what Andrew mentioned earlier. And so I did gasp a sigh of relief, because one of us is going to look stupid if we've got wildly different numbers. And just one thing before I move on from this. The reason why we actually see the crosses significantly below the forecast is partly because we believe a number of manufacturers are actually selling below cost, and actually when we speak to manufacturers, many often sort of privately acknowledge this as a sort of a market share grab, but naturally no one's going to publicly admit making a loss on every system sold. The other reason is many of these contracts are actually forward contracts. So if you're signing a contract for delivery in a year or 2 years' time, you're often negotiating a much lower price. What we do see, just before I move on, we do see much lower costs than this reported in the media. And actually, when we've sort of tried to sort of dig into them, we're basically quite skeptical. When for the stationary market, there are a number of instances where I've actually sort of been speaking to sort of utilities who are potential customers for these systems, and they've mentioned how they've seen a company release a cost figure in a press release. They phoned up the company director and said, if you can give me that cost figure, I'll buy you. And the example I'm thinking of is I'll buy a 50 megawatt system here and now, and we'll deploy it next year. Understandably, the 50 megawatt system order did not go through. The price is that people are typically understating the costs essentially. But just as an aside, before we sort of dive back into the details of microgrids, It's on the energy storage front, we do actually see, the reducing costs and various other drivers, such as increasing penetration of renewable energy, changing grid patterns, changing demand patterns. We actually see the total installed capacity going from 1.2 gigawatts last year to just over 11 gigawatts, so a 9-fold increase by 2020. And that equates to around 31 gigawatt hours. So moving back to the microgrids and sort of where we stand with them. So we've talked about the drivers, we've talked about like the costs and the resource, and how that resource could change with PV, with energy storage, with potentially sort of fuel cells or other technologies. But I suppose what's always crucial is, so who are the customers? What type of clients are there, and what type of clients are buying these systems? And so, if you look at this chart, I mean, many of the criteria at the top, so reliability, the energy costs, energy security, are familiar from when we talked about major drivers. And then, if you look at the left-hand column, you're actually seeing sort of main customer segments. And so on the main customer segments, the ones that we think are most interesting here are C&I, so commercial and industrial customers, institutional customers, and also the military, but it's probably a bit more of a niche market there, often dedicated to the US. It's hard to avoid at the moment because that's where we're seeing so many case studies. But let's just dive into sort of a few of these, because I think they have very interesting characteristics that do differentiate them, and also you can understand sort of these are projects that are actually happening. And so these are projects that, if you're looking at exploring sort of the microgrid market, you do need to understand where it's working at the moment. So this first one, this is an example for an institutional institutional organization, I suppose. So Princeton University in New Jersey, and over the last two and a half decades, I suppose, they've actually been building up, so gradually expanding this microgrid on their site, and the main reason for this was actually to participate in the New Jersey and the PJM energy markets. And PJM in particular has become sort of significantly more attractive for sort of third-party owners in the last sort of year and a half, 2 years or so. But so that was what sort of drove this project. But if you look at the technologies as well, from a technology standpoint, this has far more resources than sort of the other system that we saw, the 29 Palms military microgrid. And one of the main reasons why this is because this is Princeton University. The microgrid is also also serving a sort of a research purpose, and so trying to explore sort of various other technologies makes a lot more sense here, because you do see sort of a huge mix here. But so we talked about the primary driver, but then actually, so harking back to Hurricane Sandy, when Hurricane Sandy did hit the East Coast in 2012, actually Princeton University, because of the microgrid they had in place, was actually able to provide electricity, was able to provide sort of warmth and care to not only the local community, not only like the inhabitants at the campus, but also for the emergency workers who were scrambling around New York and some of the other states, like desperately trying to sort of restore working order, I suppose. And so I think this is a great example of one of these sort of maybe not the primary, but one of the additional benefits that you do see with sort of microgrid projects. Looking at this one, this is just a commercial building, so the Bank of America building in New York City, and here this is sort of a much simpler concept. They do have a number of sort of thermal storage options, gas, CHP, but the project was really just done to save on their electricity bill. So here we talked about spark spreads at the beginning, and so spark spreads being the difference between cost of gas generation and the retail electricity price. And here you have relatively low the cost of gas generation in New York State and in New York, but then you've got very high retail electricity prices. So here they were able to secure between a 5 and 7 year payback on their system, and then once again they can fall back on all of the additional benefits that a microgrid can provide. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I wouldn't sort of focus on the off-grid case or to the remote location. I mean, there are very much sort of two sides to this coin. The first is if you're looking at sort of industry sort of working in remote areas that need electricity. So we often do a lot of work with some of the larger oil and gas companies and also mining companies. And so they need a secure electricity supply, and they're willing to pay for that electricity supply. Often a microgrid is one of the better ways and one of the quicker ways they can actually do this. And so what I wanted to do here is just highlight the ease of doing business and then the population without electricity prices. So you have those remote locations where sort of a mining company could be interested, but the other side of this coin is just a broader question about rural electrification. And so how do you ensure that that increasing, if not everyone in your population, has full access to electricity? And the reason why I didn't want to, and I won't dwell on this, is because this very much just comes down to a question of like every government's policy. In many of these cases, the final customer will not be able to afford a microgrid system. I mean, across Africa, you see sort of solar lanterns taking off. You're seeing the emergence of some small microgrids. There's a company, Orb Energy, which is actually working largely out of India, which does this and has sort of quite a successful business model. But a lot of this is supported by sort of a development bank or charity finance. And so this very much, from our perspective, it's sort of somewhat, it's a fascinating space, but it's somewhat sort of less relevant when we're looking at sort of future applications for microgrids. And in a sort of a similar note, just to try and sort of talk about sort of where that wonderful sort of grey blurred line for microgrids is. So when does the microgrid actually just become your national power grid? And I mean, you can essentially, when we've done sort of market sizing exercises, whether it's for storage, whether it's for other technologies, like trying to sort of draw that distinction is, you end up having to draw a line in the sand at some point. And so this is sort of quite an interesting example where this is an island in the Azores, so the Graciosa Island, where actually a German system integrator and sort of software provider, Unicos, they've been working on this island for a number of years, looking to essentially to provide for the whole island's electricity. And they're looking to do that with sort of with a mixture of renewable energy generation technologies, and then also with energy storage. So their main interest is energy storage, and they're trying to replace diesel. But once again, when we look at that, we think of this as a sort of energy storage renewables integration application rather than a microgrid as such. Now, so just sort of conscious of time, I suppose, and I'd like to sort of ideally leave some time for questions. When we look at this space, naturally you have to understand who the main players in the market are. This is by no means a comprehensive list. We really just pulled this up. We have a project database of over 550 just stationary energy utility scale energy storage projects, and then thousands and thousands more for for the renewable energy generation technologies. And so what I did here is just looked at a few of the case studies, some of which we've discussed earlier today, and just pulled the companies that seem to stand up. So if your company's not up here and you have done a microgrid, you can come and yell at me afterwards, as someone did yesterday. So just looking at this, I suppose the message here is that it's a very crowded space. There are a few companies, and you're often working in partnerships on these projects, and so there are few companies that can really supply everything from sort of the controls and all the sort of the different resource types. And often it wouldn't make sense for one company to do that. But you do have sort of large organizations like ABB, which also owns Power Corp. So they do provide sort of a lot of breadth. But then you've got more specialist ones who are definitely worth looking at. And so this is my final slide, I think, just in case one surprises me. But this final one is kind of a question that I wanted to sort of put to the audience, not necessarily for an answer, but to try and spur some thought. Is so what does the ownership or what does the business model for microgrids look like in the future? And actually, this question is very much related to sort of just the energy storage market as well. It's and broadly speaking, in a world where we're seeing increasingly distributed generation, who do we expect to own the relationship between the customer and the generation? And who will manage the grid in between? And so, just looking at some of the examples here, will the utility manage this relationship? So the utility could install a microgrid, essentially run it as an incumbent utility has run their generation and supply for years past, and in likely many years in the future. Or do you see different scenarios where it's customer generated? So here you're seeing a customer. We've seen the commercial and sort of community segments where customers are no longer they're no longer interested in just paying their dues to a utility, and they're far more interested in having control over their electricity supply. And or do you get interesting third parties springing up and actually just signing independent sort of PPAs with the end consumer? And so I mean there's a whole range, and I mean you could really dive into these in much more detail, and it goes much beyond the work of microgrids, where if you look at more broadly sort of residential self-consumption and sort of residential energy storage opportunities, I mean there you're really thinking. In many states, in many countries across sort of Europe, in Japan, where you have high electricity prices, people are exploring what they can do with. It's not microgrids as such, but it's they're pulling up their level of self-consumption to 80% or so, and so really reducing their dependence on the utility. And how the utilities globally react to this will be fascinating. And I think that's actually the big question that we're asking internally, and what we're being asked about by many of our clients. And so, just to sort of sum up, I suppose, it's when we think of, or when I think of the global microgrid market, at the moment, I think we can all agree it's a relatively small market so far, but there's huge potential, and it merges very much into what I've been trying to sort of portray as a message in a way, is the fact how closely it is aligned with just a world where we do see more distributed generation, and we see sort of interesting new companies and also utilities changing their business models to try and capture that opportunity. As we see at the moment, we're at the very, very beginning here for microgrids, where we're often sort of single or maybe dual resource, but you're seeing there's a whole range of opportunities that I think we're seeing it sort of be deployed in early case studies, and we expect that to continue, because as you saw from the main drivers that I talked about, is these often people aren't doing this out of a sort of a charitable sense. I mean, the market's tough, but there are plenty of customers and there's plenty of opportunity out there. And as a result, I think, globally, but we can isolate this by region, there's a huge opportunity here. So thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions.